forgiving them. Luke, the 23rd chapter, the 33rd through the 34th verse, according to the NRSV version. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. The story is told of children in a Sunday school class learning about forgiveness. The Sunday school teacher had just concluded her lesson and wanted to make sure she had made her point. She said, can anyone tell me what you must do before you obtain forgiveness of sin? There was a short pause, and then from the back of the room, a small boy spoke up. Sin, he said. You must sin in order to obtain forgiveness. This childlike perspective of forgiveness is not far removed from the perspective of adults who have grown to see forgiveness through a fixed, one-dimensional lens of committed acts of sin and trespasses against one another. Yet there is no true accountability for the omitted or overlooked trespasses that occur when persons feel justified in what they are doing. When forgiveness is only associated with the acts of external sin, the phrases, I'm sorry, please forgive me, and I didn't mean to do it, and I won't do it again, become the expected responses of verbal contrition when one has trespassed against another, or at least we believe it should be. Forgiveness from this perspective is only understood through a lens of sin that is committed and not pain that is inflicted by those who have been omitted to provide their neighbor with acts of love, respect, and justice. Forgiveness from this perspective comes as a personal act of forgiving one another in advanced reciprocity, in the hope that because you have forgiven your sister or your brother, that God would in turn forgive you. But what happens when forgiveness is necessary for those who know what they do and feel like they have done no wrong? The saying, they know not what they do, does not mean that the enemies of Christ were ignorant of the fact of his crucifixion. They knew what they were doing when they marched him from hall to hall to stand in judgment. They knew what they were doing when they beat and scourged him. They knew what they were doing when they put a crown of thorns on his head. They knew what they were doing when they cried out, crucify him. They knew the excruciating pain he would suffer by being nailed to the cross. They were right there as he was dying with much pain and agony. So what did Jesus really mean when he says they knew not? They knew not or were ignorant of the extent of their crime. They knew not that it was the Lord of glory they were crucifying, and that they were only fulfilling God's plan by lifting him up, because the end result would be that all men would be drawn unto him. Just like the thems in your life knew not what they were doing when they did you wrong. They knew what they were doing when they fired you, but they didn't know that their leaving freed up time for you to start your own business. They knew that they were leaving you, but what they didn't know is that you were the woman or the man that someone had been praying for, so their ending was someone else's bright beginning. Stop crying over the thems and start praying the prayer of forgiveness for them. Bottom line, Jesus is not saying that you have to forgive ignorance. He is letting us know that ignorance is forgivable. So the greater question becomes, how do we forgive folks when they know what they are doing, but they just don't know the impact of their actions? How do we in our own power forgive? Because sometimes that pain is very hurtful and it's very deep. Dr. Gerald Jampolsky, author of the book Forgiveness, the greatest healer of them all, states, forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past could be any different. We must understand that forgiveness is required even when we are not at fault. Biblical forgiveness never waits for an apology, which makes us take a deeper look at the manner in which Jesus prays for forgiveness. Who was the them to whom Jesus was referring to in the text? Was it Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, the one who is said to have organized the plot to kill Jesus? Or was it Herod, the one who treated him with contempt and mocked him? Was it Pontius Pilate, who had not one but two opportunities to stop the crucifixion of this innocent man? Yet he washed his hands of the situation and allowed an angry mob to decide that Jesus would be the one to be crucified on the cross at Calvary. How could he forgive Caiaphas, Herod, and Pontius Pilate? How do we forgive a lone shooter who opens fire in an elementary school, a grocery store, or a church? How do we forgive our nation's most prominent leaders and Supreme Court justices who changed laws and legislation that set our progress back years? How do we forgive a justice system that fails to provide just treatment and protection to those who are vulnerable and voiceless? How do we forgive white supremacists and conservative leaders who see people of color as terrorists within our own country, yet stand in support of the buffoonery that takes place on a daily basis in our nation's highest office? How do we forgive the act of yet another shooting of an unarmed black man or black woman? How do we forgive the things that cause us to question the human condition and bring up questions of theodicy, of how could a perfect and good God permit evil in the world? Jesus' words resonate with our own internal conflict of forgiveness. He bears witness to the struggle we all have at some point in life and that we have encountered, where we need divine intervention concerning the acts of forgiveness. This is not to suggest that forgiveness is solely divine, but it does bear in mind that forgiveness, specifically in cases where there is no repentance, are more difficult to extend to those who commit reckless and intentional acts of evil against us. Jesus, in this moment, gives me the freedom to pass on trying to forgive personal forgiveness and allowing the act of forgiveness to be laid in the hands of God in what then becomes divine prerogative. Divine prerogative says, God, I don't have the power within myself to forgive them because I'm right here in the midst of the struggle. I'm right here in the midst of foreclosure because they left me when I was sick and without any money. I'm right here in the midst of planning a funeral for my loved one because of the reckless nature of someone else. God, I know they need forgiveness, but I need you to step in and forgive them until I make peace with the situation. Jesus, who is still in control until the very end, refuses to hold his enemies hostage and shows us how to have the final word in our situation, even when you are still struggling with what they did to you. Jesus in this moment is reminded of his own words to pray for those who persecute you and think all manner of evil against you. Jesus remains in the driver's seat of life even until the end and doesn't allow unforgiveness to reign. The story is told of how a woman named Ruth Youngsman, who was speaking at the Prison Fellowship Ministries banquet several years ago, stating, "The man I ate dinner with tonight killed my brother." The words spoken by a poised and polished woman sent shockwaves through the audience. She told how the man named John had murdered her brother during a robbery, served 18 years in Walla Walla prison, then settled into a life on a dairy farm where she met him 20 years after his crime. Compelled by Christ's command to forgive, Ruth had gone to her enemy and pronounced forgiveness. Then she had taken him to her father's deathbed, prompting reconciliation. A year later, at the prison fellowship banquet, John, the man Ruth had spoken of the year before, was now the speaker at the banquet. While he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion as he said, "Christians are the only people I know that you can kill their son and they'll make you part of the family." In this scenario, in this passage today, as we look at the scene on the cross, Jesus was that son in the crowd that the crowd would kill. But what they did not know is that what would take place was for a much bigger purpose than them. Their killing of Jesus would connect God's plan of making us all family. They killed a son, but God made us all family. Their unjust wrongdoing would work out for good for all humanity. I'm reminded of the words of Joseph, who was a biblical poster child for forgiveness in Genesis 50 and 20, when he said to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for my good." Joseph's words remind us of the words of the songwriter who said, "I've had trials and tribulations, unexpected situations, living here below. I have friends who've turned their backs on me and left me standing in the cold. I've been hurt in the church, attempting to do God's work by people who called themselves saints. Many times I felt like giving up, but the Spirit said you can't. You know, the Lord will put you through a lot of things you can't understand, and for everything he allows, there's a reason. So in my life, the devil gets no glory. Everywhere I go, I'll tell the story. He meant it for my good, so I can't stand here saying that I forgive